Good afternoon and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gilla, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis. So glad to have you with us today. For our participants joining us on Zoom, throughout this webinar, you are muted. We can neither see nor hear you. We also can't call unraised hands, but we do want you to participate in the conversation, and you use the chat feature to do that. So please feel free to send in your questions, comments, and greetings throughout this webinar, and we will bring you into the conversation. I want to thank and acknowledge my friend and co-host, Cynthia Williams, who's the Brown School's Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships. Cynthia will be in the chat, responding to your questions and comments, and then also representing you in the room by giving voice to your questions and comments at the end of the program. As we start 2021 here at Open Classroom, much of our content is in celebration of the central role and significant contributions that African Americans have made to our nation's history, life, and culture. Black History Month, or African American History Month, was the brainchild of historian Carter G. Woodson, and since 1976, every U.S. president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. The Brown School is just getting an early start with a few January events like today's. We do have other programs going on as well, and I want to flag for you that 1 week from today, Tuesday, January 26th, we have a program on implementation and sustainability, lessons learned from Rwandan intervention for global childhood early development. This is offered in partnership with colleagues from Boston College, International Center for Child Health and Development, Smart Africa, and the African Initiative at Washington University. So if you're interested, there's plenty of time. Please do sign up for that and other upcoming programs. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Nicole Hudson is Assistant Vice Chancellor for the Academy for Diversity and Inclusion here at Washington University. That's a role I think she's held for about 2.5 years. Before that, she was Deputy Mayor for Racial Equity and Priority Initiatives here in the city of St. Louis. And before that, she served as Communications Director for the Ferguson Commission. So here today to speak to us about finding our place in the change, please welcome Nicole Hudson.
Thank you, Janet, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Cynthia and the Brown School and everybody for inviting me here today. So before I get started, I want to begin by acknowledging how we end up here today in this Zoom room. I want to acknowledge that the institution that brings us together sits on land with a history, the ancestral land of the Osage people who were removed by threat or force. I acknowledge the Osage elders, past, present, and future, and acknowledge the benefits we receive from the injustices done to their people. I acknowledge that I am not separate from them or they from me, and that our fate, our work, is inextricably tied. I acknowledge the privilege of the time, the mental and emotional space that I possess for me to be here today, discussing concepts and issues with you virtually from the comfort of my home that are life and death to many people, daily stressors and lived realities that call for urgency, action, and boldness from those of us for whom conversations on these topics are a choice. And on this day after MLK observed and leading into Black History Month, I acknowledge the people I know about and who I may never be aware of, who make it possible for me to be here, who continue to fight for the systemic celebration of the whole of my humanity, and who will be our collaborators in a future where we thrive more than we fight, starting today. I'm gonna set my timer for 60 seconds. And in that time, I wanna encourage each of you to take some time to write or just think or type to yourself your own set of acknowledgements about what you want to be aware of and acknowledge as you enter this conversation today. Didn't know I was going to make you work, did you? Okay. Thank you. So for those who have seen me present before, you probably know that I'm a big fan of these three questions. How did we get here? What does it mean to be here? And where do we go from here? I was first introduced to this series of questions by my colleague Eric Ratnoff, working with the storytelling team at Forward Through Ferguson, the nonprofit that morphed out of the Ferguson Commission. Local and nationally loved artivist and alum Dee Nichols was on that storytelling team and ended up incorporating these three questions into one of her sticky notes to self. It's a project she has where she makes simple designs out of sayings and phrases and thoughts. We came upon these questions in the process of writing a grant proposal for a project that looked at education policy in the St. Louis region, how complex it is, and why it was important to understand that complexity as the end of the busing program approached. The project description was too long, it was very layered, and it was full of sidebars and details because it's complicated and it's very important. And at some point, my colleague Eric broke it down into these three questions, which was a much more straightforward entry point into all the details and the complexity. So when I think about what I've learned about finding my place in change, these three questions have been invaluable. We just practiced together one of the ways to go about that first question. And I have found that a thorough accounting of the second question can open up possibilities for the third that without taking that time, I may not have ever considered. My goal today is to share a few stories, what I've learned from them, with the goal of offering you some ways to consider your own journey. And so I thought I would start today with a little bit of my personal context, the arc of how I ended up here in front of you with these stories to tell. So obviously it goes way further back than this, but in the interest of time, I'll start here with these fine people. In the center, if you haven't already guessed or haven't seen this photo with its appropriate tags on Facebook or don't know them personally, are my parents, James and Sandra Hudson. To the left of my dad, his parents, Milton and Osceola Weatherspoon, and to the right of my mom, her parents, James and Lucille Johnson. It's August of 1967, and they're in the backyard on Cabany Place in the West End neighborhood in the city of St. Louis. Milton worked at the Carondelet Foundry, while Mama Ossie, as we called her, managed the household. My mom's dad, James Johnson, after experiencing the racial limitations of advancement at the post office in downtown St. Louis, opened a corner store that was demolished recently as part of the land clearance for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, footprint north of downtown. He and my grandmother, Lucille, were partners in working that store. All of my grandparents began their work life after high school, some before finishing high school. So everyone was very proud of the newlywed couple, as they would be the first in each family to complete college. My father had attended and had recently graduated from Harris Teachers College, currently known as Harris Stowe State University. My dad's counselor at Sumner High School, where he went to high school, had not mentioned college to him. But Mrs. Dove, who lived down the street from my dad on Newberry Terrace in the city of St. Louis, had taken it upon herself to encourage young James. It was through odd jobs and encouragement from Mrs. Dove that my father was able to pay for and sit for the test that admitted him to Harris Teachers College. At the time of their marriage, he was an elementary school teacher in Poughkeepsie, where my mother was about to start her junior year at Vassar. My mother's path to college also included outside influence. After testing into St. Louis Public Schools gifted program in the pre-desegregation world of St. Louis, she had a number of integrated schooling experiences that led her to Northwest High School. Her time at Northwest High School coincided with activist Freda Witherspoon's tenure as school counselor while she finished her PhD here at Washington University. Freda's thesis was related to college access for Black students. Every Black student in my mom's graduating high school class got scholarships to top universities. As a sidebar, Freda and her husband are credited with organizing the desegregation of one of St. Louis City's most exclusive private streets. leading ultimately to the landmark Supreme Court case that struck down restrictive covenants, Shelley versus Kramer. After their wedding, my mother did finish Vassar, where she was one of the first dozen Black students to do so. And those Black students also found time to take over the administration building, demanding Vassar better support its Black students in the future. And James and Sandra found their way back to St. Louis for my father to enter Washington University's medical school as one of its first Black students, an opportunity that he got through a national program designed to increase the number of Black males in medical school. I am obviously skipping a bunch of really good stories that I could be here telling you all day. But the point is that this is my foundation. This is how I got here. This is my history, and without it, I'm not here on this Zoom having this conversation with you. To some, my family's story is one of hard work. To some, it's a story of luck and happenstance. To some, it's a story of privilege. To some, a story of exceptionalism and inspiration. To some, it's a story of the American dream, a story of every family. And while there are families from all backgrounds who share a similar story, and families that look like mine that share a similar story, what we know is that statistically, when it comes to Black families and families of color, my story is still an outlier. This picture, again, is from 1967. The Civil Rights Act was only 3 years old. The Fair Housing Act wouldn't pass for another year. And St. Louis Public Schools would not roll out a funded desegregation program for another 14. In that context, they were trailblazers. But if you ask them, they did not think that 60 years later, Black people would still be blazing the same trails. They thought they were at the beginning of a wave. But today, the path they traveled is traveled just about as rarely by people who look like me. A group of researchers from this very school that I'm hosted by today produced the For the Sake of All report in 2013, which gave us a detailed look at just how much inequities hadn't changed over the past 50 years between Blacks and whites in St. Louis. The most striking statistic from that report to me is that of infant mortality. While everyone's outcomes have improved, 50 years ago, a Black baby was twice as likely than a white baby to die before its first birthday. Today, that ratio is more like 3 times. It's through that lens, on the shoulder of those people and experiences, that I see these points, not just points on a map of St. Louis, but my own map to understanding just how policies, legislation, and leadership decisions have shaped the individual lives of my grandparents, my parents, and my own. It is through that lens that I have come to seek out stories. And as I learn each of them, see before me the layers of place, of policy, of choice and opportunity, and feel the enormity of the things that had to come together to land me where and who I am today. And how many things still need to come together so that my story is not a statistical outlier, but an unsurprising norm seen at the population level. Now, it may or may not be a surprise to you that I didn't know the details of many of these stories or tie them to that larger frame when I became part of the work of the Ferguson Commission. In fact, when I was initially approached about working on the commission, my first answer was nope. I was at the time freelancing and consulting. I had been working with The Beacon, which is a nonprofit news startup here in St. Louis, and I had gone off on my own. And I was starting to think about building a business. I was doing well, and I got this phone call based on how I facilitated conversations post-Ferguson on my Facebook page. And I got this phone call saying, would you be interested in being the communications director or being interviewed to be the communications director for the Ferguson Commission? And I just wasn't interested in what I saw as a political move by the state of Missouri to do something without doing anything. But I have a rule that I would like to pass along today, which is I never say no to a meeting. So I said yes to meeting with Bethany Johnson-Javois, who was the managing director for the commission and who is currently CEO of the Integrated Health Network. And she basically said, they think that they're doing this to do nothing, but I am here to ensure that we do all that we can do, and I need your help. And so I couldn't say no to that. And so I said yes. And we went into it thinking about how we could really elevate the pain, the frustration that we were hearing from people in the commission meetings, and use that to connect for people that policy is linked to these issues. The work was constantly under scrutiny from all sides, from not just two sides, but multiple sides. We didn't have a lot of time or resources to think and plan. We had to deliver and pivot and learn and deliver and pivot again. But that process birthed a number of tools and frameworks that I still use today, two of which I will share with you this afternoon. This tool was developed in our work with Forward Through Ferguson, the nonprofit that came out of the commission. And this is the tool that started to really give me the understanding I needed to see my stories in a different way. So I'll briefly give you the origin story and walk you through this tool. The origin of this tool was a series of conversations with diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners and organizations in the St. Louis region who felt like the existence of Forward Through Ferguson, a nonprofit following the commission, was going to compete in an already crowded and confused field. And we wanted to be clear that that was not our intent, that we saw ourselves as focusing on policy, focusing on regional shifts. And so we had a 2-day retreat with about 10 different individuals and organizations who work on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the region. And we came out with this understanding. So what we started to find in our discussions were that there were organizations who focus mostly on working with institutions, corporations, on sort of awareness and sort of first step education around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they mostly worked on diversity. Then there were organizations that worked more with individuals, and they worked on things like internalized oppression and internalized superiority, and started to get into the history and sort of the way that these things show up in us as individuals. So they did lots of individual understanding work. And then there were organizations that worked mostly with institutions on changing their policies and practices and transforming behavior. And so that's how we got to this visual that you can find on Forward Through Ferguson's website. You can either Google Forward Through Ferguson racial equity tool, or there's a URL on the bottom of the screen that you can find this tool with some explanation. That there are ultimately about 3 phases to moving toward equity. And we defined equity as a future state in which outcomes were no longer determined by, for this case, race. You can more broadly define equity as by group, whatever group you're seeing in your data is disproportionately impacted. There's the phase of just being aware that it's there and acknowledging it, maybe understanding some terms and some ways in which it exists and agreeing that it's a problem, that it needs to be worked on. There's a phase of starting to understand how we got where we are, how the inequity, why it exists. So maybe digging into policy and history, understanding how these things show up in institutions and organizations, how they show up in us individually. And then there's the phase of transforming. This is usually where there's an investment of time and resources to go from one point to another. So you've measured some stuff, you've disaggregated your numbers, and you can see that the issue is that disproportionately, we'll say for sake of example, Black kids are not graduating high school at the same rate as other kids. And so you would set a plan to transform that to a specific place, whether that be equal or better, whatever the number is you're after, and you put in a strategy and a plan to transform. And we're clear that these things happen on multiple levels, that there is an individual journey that people go on to go through these different phases. There's an institutional sort of organizational layer where an organization or institution may decide that they want to undertake some of this work. And then hopefully at the regional or population level, you're also seeing things change, and that these don't necessarily happen at the same time. So you could have an organization or an institution that is making transformative change. They're changing their policies, they're being transparent about their numbers, they made a commitment, they're investing in it. And you can have individuals inside that institution or organization that don't yet agree it's a problem and don't see why it's worth the effort. And then you could have things that happen at the region or population level that either interrupt, so it could be external pressure, like a series of protests. It could be external pressure, like the executive order from a couple months ago about teaching issues of race and privilege at certain institutions that have government money. So that would impact the ability perhaps to do some of that work. So seeing these things, kind of how they map out, I use this often as a problem-solving map, helps to see, maybe locate yourself, locate your organization, locate the problem it is that you're seeking to solve, and kind of understand which pieces need to move in order to move things forward. So as we layered the region's historic and current policies onto how they impact the day-to-day lives of St. Louisans, so looking at some of those institutional and regional things as they pertain to individuals, that's when I started to see some of the same things for my family and my work and my own responsibility. So another tool from Forward Through Ferguson was this set of principles for the how of approaching work on regional change. So a lot of organizations would come to us and say, tell us what to do. Give us the list of things to do. And we would often say to them, tell us what your challenges are. Tell us what your business names as success. Tell us where your pain points are. And it was more about how you approach something than it was what specific things you did first, because that was different for each organization based on a different context. So we saw as a pattern these 4 principles that came up over and over again. The first was to apply and model a racial equity lens. So again, defining equity as a future state in which outcomes are no longer predictable, being able to apply that to your work. So a good example for some internal consideration is you might ask a company, what does your workforce look like? And they may say, oh, we have a really diverse workforce. Okay, what does that look like when you consider the different levels of responsibility in your company? Is it diverse all the way across the board? Is it random which people from which backgrounds might be in leadership roles and management roles? And you might see that it's not. So being able to really kind of look at things through that lens is a key way, and it'll tell you where to look first. Committing to radical listening, this is something that centers the voices of the people that you seek to have a better outcome. So being willing to understand that a program you've designed or the way that you've done business might not be what people need, and to invite that feedback and to really hear that and be able to committed to changing how it is that you approach partnering with a group of people to reflect that feedback. It's also involving people in decision making, not just asking for an opinion and keep on walking, but really design processes and ways to have voice from those you're seeking to have a better outcome, be part of real decision making. Pursuing radical collaboration. So in St. Louis, and I've also heard this mirrored in other cities, regions, we often have multiple organizations focused on the same thing. And what we often saw was that in the ecosystem of funding or perhaps community attention, that would actually make the problem worse. And so what might it look like to ask yourself as an organization, what if we partnered with this other organization? We do 1 through 4 really well. They do 5 through 10 really well. And even if we don't merge as an organization, maybe we change up what we focus on for our offerings so that we can be better serving the community at large and centering the folks who need what it is that we're offering instead of centering our need to get funding or whatever sort of thing might be centered as first. Focusing on policy and systems, understanding that a program ultimately should lead us to not need that program anymore. That how are we changing outcomes and making sure that our programs are furthering our ability to close gaps and to at least be able to shift that program to serve the next thing over time. And also keeping in mind that systems overlap. So in a context where there have been decades and decades of policies that have produced decades and decades of results, when you just change one of the systems and you leave the other intact, without that awareness of how those other systems are working, you may end up deciding that your intervention was a failure because it was only operating in one part of the ecosystem. So really keeping that focus as you go to solve systemic problems around equity. And as I think about over time, how I've used these personally, they've really become a good sort of remix to consider that second question, what does it mean to be here? So when I think about the first one, and my work more broadly, I'm thinking about committing to learning what a racial equity lens actually is. So this is a term and a phrase that people have picked up and a lot of people are saying it, but I'm here to tell you that even though this has been part of my day-to-day work now for almost a decade, I'm still learning new applications of what it really means to think through that lens, what it means to consider how I show up as a neighbor, using it to consider how I show up on a board, using it to consider what decisions I make about schooling for my children and being realistic about what sort of impact that has. So this idea of using a racial equity lens, it's a constant iterative learning path, and being clear that the idea and the need to do it exists because we have constructed and perpetuated a society that creates outcomes on autopilot that are disproportionate, means that we have to constantly be aware and thinking about what that means in any situation, because we're going upstream. We're going upstream until we're not anymore. And so committing to that continuous learning has been something for me that's been really important. The committing to radical listening, I have sort of personally internalized as engaging people, ideas, and situations that push me. So when I'm making a decision or have the opportunity to offer a point of view, I will often check with folks who maybe don't have the same access or privilege that I do. I might check with folks who I know are going to disagree with the decision I'm about to make. I will stumble upon a situation or a conversation where there's a little bit of tension, and instead of walking away from it, I'll use it as data to ask myself, okay, what about this is causing tension? What am I bringing to it? Am I bringing something to it? What might I add to it so that that tension is addressed? And what might I learn from the process of not walking away from that tension? So for my personal radical listening, that's really come to engaging people, ideas, and situations that push me. The pursuing radical collaboration to me has kind of morphed into, as a personal mantra, not going it alone or designing it so that only I can do it unless it's absolutely necessary. So is the conversation I'm about to go have, is this initiative that I feel the need to start, is this project I'm about to undertake, can I have a partner? Is there someone else who can do this with me, so that I have an opportunity to take an inventory of what I may or may not do well, or that I might do really well and want to spend more time on? So can I find somebody to spend some time on some other stuff? And then also thinking about, I thought a lot about regional capacity and what it means to not be the only one who knows how to do something or has figured something out. And maybe if the only path is one where I'm the only one who can do something or somebody has to call me, maybe I should do it a little bit differently so that there are multiple folks who can hold that knowledge. So there are multiple ways that don't get bottlenecked with me. And then the last one, the focusing on policy and systems, I like to ask myself if I'm leaving something better than how I found it. As I'm doing something, as I'm investing my energy, is part of the energy I'm investing making it easier for someone else to pick it up should I win the lottery and not work anymore, or whatever it is that I'm doing. How am I making it a little bit more institutionalized, a little bit more of a system, a little bit more solid for someone who might come after me or have to wrestle with the same thing? So all of these, both organizational, sort of Ford through Ferguson racial equity, regional racial equity principles, and then also the remixes that I have done for me personally, were very much a part of how I made my decision to go to City Hall. So I was still leading and figuring out how to lead and how to create an organization post Ford through Ferguson. And we had a mayoral race here in St. Louis that was very racially divided. We're about to have that race again. It was a very tense race. And the candidate I supported did not win, but the candidate that did win reached out to ask if I might be interested in joining their cabinet to focus on racial equity. And I radically listened to probably 50 people who all had very strong, very different opinions about the futility of such a move, or what it might do to my reputation, or whether I'd be able to get anything done. And there were people all across the spectrum. Some people are like, you absolutely have to say yes. You absolutely have to do this. And other people were like, you absolutely have to say no. There's no way you can do this. And ultimately, I decided that I had to give it a shot. And it was in that transition that I made this map. And I knew that I wanted to give it a shot. I knew that I had to make the leap. I felt that if I had done the work I had done to get people to focus on systems and policy, and I had the opportunity to go in one of the places where systems and policy happened for our city, that I needed to give it a try. But I didn't necessarily have the why sort of anchored into my choice. So I kind of went back to that question of how did I get here? And how does it connect to where I'm going? And I started to make this map of all of these different places in St. Louis that my family had touched that were part of me. And City Hall suddenly became a very real next step. It was almost like I could hear my grandfather, who held on to his store for probably a decade longer than he should have, because he was convinced the city had a plan for the Pruitt-Igoe spot, and his store was a handful of blocks from there. And he held on to it until he ultimately decided to sell it. But it was almost like I could hear his voice, like, girl, you better go try. Like, you better go into City Hall. You have this opportunity, you better go do it. So it was really important to me to be able to feel that and to be anchored in that. And it was ultimately that commitment and that anchoring that led me to know when it was time to leave. I was able to separate the how I got here from the what does it mean to be here piece and compare notes, right? I was able to compare the notes of what was happening and what wasn't happening and be really clear in what I came to do and why, and see where there were gaps. So I was decided, but not actively looking, when the announcement for the role that I currently have came about. And my first answer was nope. But by the third time somebody sent me the job description, I went back to my map and my journey of how I got there. And I was able to read the job description in a new way. And I was able to see opportunities that I would have otherwise missed. And this very much informed my interview process. I spent less energy trying to match the job requirements. So I'm not a traditional diversity, equity, inclusion person. I have never worked in higher ed before. So I spent a lot less of my energy trying to match what it was that was in the job description. And I spent more of my energy being really specific with the committee about how I thought my experiences could bring something different to the role. And I was clear that I wasn't a traditional diversity inclusion person, and I wasn't going to approach it in the same way. And I was clear about how WashU has, does, and can play a role in the things that are really important to me personally and professionally. And I think that has a lot to do with how the Academy has ultimately evolved, which I'll talk a little bit about now. So one of the first things that I did was recreate this graph that might look familiar from my Ford through Ferguson days, and thinking about how at WashU we have student, staff, and faculty who are individuals, and they experience the institution in different ways. As an institution, we have schools, we have campuses, we have different departments that are part of the central fiscal unit and aren't connected to our academic. We have a medical campus. So we have all these different sort of institutional and organizational groupings. And we have a culture as an institution. We have a culture that bubs up against, we sit on 3 different jurisdictions in our property in terms of municipally. We also exist in the larger region. We exist in the state of Missouri, and we exist in this world right now. And so all of those things are at play as we think about how to become aware as an institution, why and how diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. Moving into how that matters specifically for us as we have the priorities of research, teaching, and patient care. Understanding what we need and who needs to come along and what the barriers and challenges might be to transforming our institution toward a more inclusive culture and climate. And ultimately, we want to sustain that. We want to not need an initiative or a department or individuals who have to work on this, because we've created a new normal. And all of these things intertwine in the same way I explained the previous graphic, that these things happen at different levels and different paces for different parts of the institution. So our theory of change at the Academy, we were really clear about how to articulate to the university community how it was that we felt it was possible to shift culture and climate on the campuses. So we talk about embracing the structural realities of diversity for our institution. So that's looking at our own data, understanding how our diversity is different than the diversity of the region is different from the diversity of the state, and what that means for especially our staff and faculty who are part of these surrounding communities, in addition to our students who may be coming in from other places that have different contexts. We wanted to focus on the impact of the individual to be the change where they are. So the fact that people experience our institution differently in all different spots, being able for them to locate themselves and understand how they're part of the change is really important. We knew that we had to reflect that our work is different, but also connected and continuing. That the work might look different in one school than it does in another school, but they add up to mean some forward motion for the institution. We understood that some basics about how to be a good community are important, like trust, like transparency, like feeling as though there's a community, celebrating wins, and understanding why things don't go well. Those are not generally seen as diversity, equity, and inclusion things, but if they're not in place, you can't make progress around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Practicing systemic awareness of what we might be missing. So understanding how higher ed works, understanding how different schools have different processes, understanding the ecosystems of student, staff, and faculty, and making sure that as we're designing solutions, we're taking those things into account and not skipping over them to create problems later. And we also talk about focusing on building capability for people to take things from one situation to another. So to learn just about, how to show up and how to say the right thing is different than learning how to be reflective and how to be in good relationship with people, so that if the wrong thing is said, that you can have the trust to say that, build the repair, and build capacity for a relationship and work moving forward. So in that theory of change, our impact statement at the Academy is to have all WashU staff and faculty fully experience and be part of actively constructing an inclusive and equitable campus culture and climate from where they are in the institution. So as Janet mentioned, I've been in this role for about 2.5 years, which, if we learn anything from the last 2 stories, it's about time for me to start to think about, well, what does this mean for me individually? And so thinking about it, I spent a lot of time over the holiday break thinking about my own impact statement and kind of coming back to some of the things I've mentioned, thinking about how can I be part of all people fully experiencing and being part of actively constructing a thriving, healed, and equitable society from where they are on the journey. So understanding that different people are entering from different spaces, And how am I orienting my energy to helping people where they are and not trying to help people be somewhere that they're not? And how do we help be part of a collective move forward? So where am I, understanding where I am and what my journey is and what's approximate to that. And so I thought of a few questions that I'll leave you with as I close that I am starting to use just in the last month to think about where I am and what my journey is. So I think about, what do I not? And I don't like to write things in the negative. I'm really big on, like, we manifest what it is we want, and things should be positive and generative. So I haven't quite figured out how not to write this in the negative, but I think the absence of something is my point here. So what do I not want to be true for today's children? And what do I have to do to make that true? What do I need to do in order for that to bear truth? What do I need to do in order for the thing I want not to be present for today's children to be true? And I started originally to write this for my children. And then I thought, no, I feel like this needs to be considerate of the different places on the journey that people are. And how can I dig myself one level further to ask about today's children generally, and what I need to do to make that bear truth for them. The second, how is insert thing here healing me? So how is this decision? How is this talk? I thought about this as I put together this talk. How is this thing I'm putting my energy into, whatever that may be, healing me? How is it healing my ancestral line? How am I thinking from the Native perspective of 7 generations past and 7 generations forward? For those who aren't familiar, elders thinking about decisions and things that are done or planted in a context of the 7 generations that came before and the 7 generations that are coming after. How can I think about healing in that way? And then how is whatever I'm putting my energy to healing for my descendants? So getting at that systems, policy, leaving it better than it was before. How am I really investing my energy in that future healing? And then asking from those answers, what does this mean for my family? What does this mean about the choices I'm making for my family? What does this mean about the choices that I'm making for my work? And what does this mean about how I take care of myself? So I leave you with those reflection questions. I leave you with the reminder that we're all on different parts of the journey. And I leave you with the hope and the wish that something from this sparked in you, and that you feel like you can tangibly take that and apply that at some point in the next 24 hours, at least the next week. So thank you for listening, and thank you for joining us today. And I think now we move to questions.
Nicole, I hope you can hear me. Would you give me a nod if you can?
I can.
Thank you. I had problems before. I want to tell you, thank you very much for your presentation. And yes, much of what you talked about really sparked a lot for me. So I'm going to say to you, the questions that you presented, how did I get here? What does it mean to be here? And where do you go from here? Are questions that can be applied in many aspects of your life. That's a great thing. Then I'm looking at your philosophy around technique that you use to deal with your day to day responsibilities, which were deliver, pivot, and learn. Another big one for me was shift. So, from all of those concepts, I got more. But I just want to ask you, what do you think those questions, that tech, that technique, and the attitude about shifting has brought for the St. Louis region first, and then Washington University? So I'm going back to 2 jobs, Ferguson Commission and WashU, not intending to leave out the mayor's office, but we only have so much time.
Right. And so what do I think those have brought to those things?
Yeah.
So I feel like I have this concept that I share with a colleague of mine. I have multiple colleagues, but I use it in a workshop I teach with Adelaide Lancaster, who's the founder of We Stories. And we talk about building muscle. and that when you go to the gym, it's not like you go once and you're suddenly, you walk out after one visit and everything's different. It's a process, and you got to work those muscles. So I feel like for the St. Louis region and the work of the Ferguson Commission with my colleagues, that we were able to connect some dots and reflect them back in a way that has given more people, I must say everybody, but more people, the muscle to stop and ask, how is this part of something bigger? Like, how might I show up differently, ask a different question? I just, for the audience, the number of times somebody asking a different question has actually resulted in different outcomes is it's not to be underestimated. So I think that's the thing for St. Louis that the Ferguson Commission work has kind of done. It's built that muscle. I would say for WashU that when I got here, I think there are a lot of people who already share this philosophy. And one of the identity realities of WashU is the feeling of siloness and, you know, different identities for different parts of the institution. And so I think maybe giving some visibility to the fact that there's already some stuff happening has, I think, built some momentum around feeling like things will be substantively different. So yeah, that's how I think, off the top of my head.
That's very good. Thank you. So I see that other people share my sentiments. Tara says, thank you for your work and this helpful presentation. The intentionality you apply to everything you do is inspiring. What do you think it is about your personality or journey or experience that has led you to prioritizing this sort of radical intention in all the decisions you make?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is privilege. Um, I've had the privilege, I really do believe it's a privilege to have the mental, emotional space and resources to think about these things. It's a luxury. And so I think the privilege of having that. I also think that, you know, it's not a secret that I was a theater major in college, and that when I was little, I said I wanted to wear a suit and go work for Disney. So this intersection between like process and organization and delivering it, I'm also a Gemini, delivering it in ways that people can hear it or enjoy it or metabolize it is something that I just have always, you know, put the show together. I like to produce and be behind the scenes. I don't need to be in front of the scenes. But this idea of putting together something that people can digest has always sort of been a part of my world.
Great. You make me smile, Nicole. Okay. Your presence and presentation, Nicole, was very empowering and motivating. I will truly embrace those questions. Rachel says transformative questions for org leaders. How is the population you serve represented in staff and board leadership? And lastly, not the last question, but the reflection, those questions are game changers and can't wait to see where they lead me. I agree with that as well. Would
Same.
you like to respond to any of those reflections?
I think that asking, you know, these questions, as I was saying, like never underestimate the power of asking questions. And I have been told that I, not that I beat around the bush, I would call it chess instead of checkers, that I find ways to ask questions that aren't that tend to not put people on defense as much as asking it a different way might. And you find that people can kind of lean in and be it's almost like an invitation to co-collaborate with you. So I thank you. I'm glad that they resonated. That's always good to hear. And, you know, please do use them. And also to acknowledge that a lot of the synthesis and intentionality that I shared comes from lots of conversation with colleagues, right? So colleagues who have similar understanding and share similar responsibilities, and just I call it grappling, you know, back and forth being reminded what you're not asking, being reminded what you haven't thought of, is a really helpful process. Just kind of pull everything on the table without again, having the privilege of pulling things out on the table without the pressure of getting it right or having a decision, and just kind of being able to grapple with stuff. That's how I've come to a lot of this synthesis.
One of the things I was really struck by in your process, you mentioned seeking out the input or the feedback of people that you expect to either disagree or push back. I would love for you to speak more about that, how you came to that, because many of us are in echo chambers where we only listen to that which validates our own impressions. So what more could you share with us on that?
So I think that I came to that through the Ferguson Commission process mostly. Actually, that's not true. Let me back up and say that as a Black female child, raised by strong parents, but mostly in predominantly white institutions, I think I got comfortable being uncomfortable from a very young age, though I didn't have the language for that. And I think the Ferguson Commission, the way that, just mentioning the word Ferguson can be a third rail, and being responsible for creating and facilitating and caring for productive conversation as the communications director really made me think deeply about how what I was going to be saying, or what I was supporting someone else saying, or what someone was about to say might be heard. I'm known for, in meetings, saying, I'm going to say something, I don't even know if it's my opinion. I just know that I can hear 3 or 4 voices saying it. And so I'm going to ask, what if this is the case? And I don't actually know until later, because I haven't had time to think about it, but I do immediately sort of hear what those pushbacks will be. So I think that experience of the Ferguson Commission really helped sharpen that muscle. I also think, I joke, my theater training of just like, what's the motivation, thinking about how a script comes together, how things, multiple pieces are moving around. I think that also has supported my comfort sort of leaning into that.
Thank you, Nicole. Joyce asked, what mentoring suggestions would you suggest for high school and college students who do not have the family background and support you have?
Yeah. I would suggest looking for people who are exhibiting or modeling the types of things that they might be interested in, and just reaching out to a handful of them. Knowing what you can find out online, or know somebody who knows somebody. And I would also, somebody taught me this about mentorship. I didn't really grasp this, and so maybe this is basic to most people, but putting it in the hands of the teen as much as possible, and letting them sort of drive what the questions are, and who they might want to talk to, and really kind of own that process, I think it could be helpful.
Sorry, Nicole. Nicole, you mentioned outcomes have been created on autopilot. I think that is something that needs to really, along with your questions, need to really be absorbed to make sure that we are not perpetrating the same outcomes.
That's
Could
right.
you speak more to that?
So I will, throw it to Jason Purnell, who has the best analogy ever for this, which, and there's a video, if you Google Jason Purnell flooded house, I think you'll find it. It's part of the In St. Louis project, which is in stlouis.worcester.edu. Jason talks about how if your house was flooded, if you left your bathtub on and you left all day and it flooded your house, when you got home, you wouldn't just turn off the faucet. You'd have water damage to clean up. You'd have, whatever else you need to figure out what damage was done and how do I repair it. So for me, he has the best, the best analogy for how once the damage is done, it's done. And to do something different doesn't actually give you the infrastructure you need to have that thing you're doing different take hold. I sometimes talk about it about compound interest. So we understand that if you leave the money in place and it builds interest over time, you've built up something. So if you have a problem or an injustice or disparity or lack of access that was in place for a time, that has built up some stuff over time. And you need to not just address the thing that was in place, you also have to address the compound interest that built up.
Well, Nicole, this always happens. An hour goes by very quickly. And before letting you offer any closing comments that you'd like to, we are a group of learners, we're a group of readers, and I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations for this audience, if they are committed to making change, exploring their place in the change, trying to be thoughtful. Are there things that you found inspirational or helpful that you'd like to suggest to them?
Yes. So I have not finished yet, but am about halfway through Cast by Isabella Wilkerson. And that has really, even again, like as I have been doing this work for my job for the last decade, she just breaks things down in a way that I didn't see before. Also, I found All My Relations, which is a podcast by two Native women that they started. I think they're in season 2. Season 1 of that was really eye-opening for me. In terms of just seeing the world in a different way and seeing all of the connections and just sort of unlocking levels of understanding for me. And if you haven't listened to the 1619 Project podcast, the podcast that accompanies that also, I learned a bunch from that I didn't know before. So the 3 that come to mind.
That's great, wonderful. So we are nearly at time. Is there any closing comment or call to action or just anything that you want to offer to this group before we wish them well?
I love all the comments in the comments in the chat about using these questions, and I just invite you to spend some time orienting yourself to where you are anchored, what matters to you, what change is proximate to you, and not to underestimate the power that you have to be the butterfly wings that has ripple effects. And thank you for spending your hour with me.
Love that. Nicole, thank you so much for spending your time and sharing your thoughts with us. I really appreciate it. To the audience, thank you for your receptiveness. And to my wonderful co-host, Cynthia, thank you so much for making this fun. Hope to see everybody soon at another open classroom. And until then, we wish you healthy and safe. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Nicole.